welcome to the deep dive. Today we're going to be looking at biodiversity. And, as a philosopher, I think you're probably already familiar with some of the issues surrounding how we define it and how we think about the value of nature.
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of those terms you see everywhere, from scientific papers to, policy documents, and it's rarely used in the same way twice.
Exactly. And today we've got some excerpts from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on biodiversity. And it's fascinating to see how philosophers of science are approaching this concept.
It is. And one thing that really struck me is that this whole concern about biodiversity, it didn't just kind of pop up in the 1980s. There was a lot of discussion going on back in the 70s about the potential loss of variety in nature.
Oh, interesting. So what were they focusing on back then before the term biodiversity really became a thing?
Well, they were already talking about the insurance value and investment value of variety. You've got C. Haskins back in 1974 writing about the need to conserve variety for future generations.
I see. So even back then there was this idea that we need to be keeping our options open, preserving potential benefits that we might not even know about yet.
Exactly. And there's this great quote from botanist H. Iltis from 1972 where he argues that we need to preserve diversity because we don't know which organisms will turn out to be valuable in the future.
Right. Almost like an ecological lottery ticket. You never know what's going to pay off down the line.
Yeah. And that forces us to ask some tough questions about intergenerational justice. Like, do we have a moral obligation to maintain this variety for future generations, even if you can't fully grasp its value right now?
Okay. So we've got this underlying idea of variety as being important. But the Stanford Encyclopedia entry also points out that even seemingly simple words like variation can be tricky when you start applying them to the real world.
Oh, absolutely. The Convention on Biological Diversity, the CBD, has this really broad definition, but then you've got organizations like IPBES using variation, and even that brings up all sorts of challenges when you try to actually measure it.
Yeah. So how do we move beyond these kind of vague notions of variety and actually start quantifying biodiversity in a meaningful way?
Well, there are a few frameworks that have been proposed. Martin L. Weitzman, back in 1992, he emphasized that biodiversity depends on both the number of things like the objects and how different they are from each other.
So it's not just a head count. It's about the degree of difference between those things.
Exactly. Two species that are very closely related might have less overall diversity than two species that are really far apart on the evolutionary tree.
Because the more distantly related species are likely to have a wider range of unique features and adaptations.
Precisely. And this leads to the concept of phylogenetic diversity, or PD, which uses evolutionary relationships to estimate the diversity of features, even those we haven't even discovered yet.
Oh, wow. So we could have two ecosystems with the same number of species, but one could have much higher phylogenetic diversity, indicating a much richer evolutionary history and maybe more unique features.
Exactly. And here's where it gets kind of counterintuitive. You could have a set of three closely related species that actually has lower future diversity than a set of two distantly related species. It all comes down to where they sit on that evolutionary tree and how much unique information each species carries.
That's fascinating. This really changes how I think about quantifying diversity. It's not just about counting. It's about understanding the evolutionary relationships and what they might tell us.
And this brings us to one of the core challenges with the term biodiversity itself. There's this tension between needing a clear, scientifically valid definition so we can measure it, and the fact that biodiversity seems to encompass so many different layers of value.
Right, because even if we can nail down a way to measure diversity, we still haven't really addressed the question of why we should care about it in the first place.
And that's where we start to see all these different framings of biodiversity emerge, each with its own emphasis and potentially its own blind spots.
So we've got the raw measure of variety, but then the question becomes variety of what and for whose benefit?
Exactly, and that's what we'll dive into next.
So we've established that biodiversity is not just about, counting up species. It's about relationships between them, their evolutionary history, these unique features that they have. And like you mentioned, there are all these different framings that emerge when we start thinking about why any of this matters.
Right. And one of the most common framings is this idea of ecosystem services. Basically how biodiversity contributes to these ecosystems working the way they do and the benefits that we humans get out of those ecosystems.
So things like clean air and water pollination of crops, regulation of climate, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, exactly. And this framing has become really popular lately as we've become more aware of how important ecosystems are for our own well-being.
Right. Makes sense. It's a way to connect biodiversity to something tangible, something that people can directly relate to and understand the value of.
Yeah, but it also raises some interesting questions like if we only value biodiversity for the services it provides to us, are we missing something? Are we overlooking its intrinsic value, the worth it has just for existing, regardless of whether it's useful to humans?
Yeah, that's a really crucial point, especially for a philosopher. The Stanford Encyclopedia entry talks about this tension between instrumental value and intrinsic value and how different ethical frameworks approach it.
Right. Some people argue that if we only focus on the instrumental value of biodiversity, we end up with a really narrow view of conservation. We only protect the parts of nature that directly benefit us in some way.
And potentially miss out on all those unknown benefits that a wider range of diversity might hold.
Exactly. It goes back to Iltis's point about the ecological lottery ticket. We just can't predict what future benefits biodiversity might provide, so reducing it to only what we understand and use right now could be a huge mistake.
And it also makes me think about our obligations to future generations. Like, if we accept that biodiversity has intrinsic value, does that strengthen the argument for its conservation, even if we can't put a dollar value on those benefits today?
Absolutely. It shifts the conversation from a purely utilitarian kind of calculation to a consideration of ethical principles and intergenerational justice.
Mm.
You know, do we have the right to just deplete the Earth's biodiversity and potentially limit the options that are available to future generations just because we can't put a precise price tag on those options today?
That's a big question, for sure. But even if we agree on the ethical importance of biodiversity, we still haven't solved the problem of how to measure it and how to account for all these different layers of value.
Right, and that's where this idea of a biodiversity calculus comes in. It's not about having one single static definition of biodiversity, but recognizing that there are lots of different ways to measure and assess it depending on what our goals are and what the context is.
So instead of searching for the one correct definition, we need a more flexible approach that acknowledges the multifaceted nature of biodiversity.
Exactly. We might use species richness as a measure in one situation, while phylogenetic diversity might be more appropriate in another. Or we might need to combine different metrics to get a more holistic picture of biodiversity.
Can you give me an example of how this might work in practice? Like, how would we apply this biodiversity calculus to a real-world conservation scenario?
Sure. Let's say we're trying to decide which areas to protect within a particular region. We could use phylogenetic diversity, or PD, to identify areas that have a really high concentration of unique evolutionary features. This would help ensure that we're conserving the broadest possible range of evolutionary history and potential.
So we're using evolutionary history as a guide to identify these hotspots of unique diversity, even if those areas don't necessarily have the highest number of species overall.
Yeah. And we might combine that with measures of ecosystem services, identifying areas that provide crucial benefits like clean water or carbon sequestration.
So it's like we're building this multi-layered map of biodiversity, where each layer represents a different aspect of its value.
Exactly. And this multi-layered approach lets us make more informed decisions about how to allocate limited conservation resources. We can take into account both ecological and human needs.
It seemed like a much more nuanced and sophisticated way to approach conservation than just focusing on species counts or habitat area.
It is, but it also highlights the ongoing challenge of communicating this complexity of biodiversity to the public and to policymakers.
Because if people don't understand what biodiversity is or why it matters, it's going to be really hard to build support for its conservation.
Absolutely. And that brings us to another important dimension of the biodiversity crisis, the crisis of definition and communication.
Right, because even with all these different framings and measures, there's still a lot of debate about what biodiversity actually means and whether the term itself is helpful or harmful.
And that's where we get into the territory of biodiversity deflationism and even biodiversity eliminativism. Some people argue that the term has become so vague and overused that it's lost its meaning and its power to motivate action.
So instead of trying to cram everything we care about into this one word, maybe we need to be more specific about the values we're trying to protect.
Exactly. If we're concerned about the loss of unique evolutionary lineages, let's talk about phylogenetic diversity. If we're worried about the decline of pollinators, let's focus on the specific services they provide and the threats they face.
By being more precise in our language, we can connect with people on a deeper level and hopefully inspire more targeted and more effective conservation efforts.
Precisely, and this more nuanced approach might also help us to navigate the complex social and cultural dimensions of biodiversity conservation.
Because it's not just about protecting nature out there, it's about understanding how human societies and cultures are intertwined with the natural world.
Right, and that's where the socio-ecological framing comes in, which we'll explore next. It challenges us to move beyond this idea of a human-nature dichotomy and to recognize the interconnectedness of ecological and social systems.
So we've been talking about biodiversity for all these different angles, the measurements, the ethics, all these different framings. But it seems like this socio-ecological perspective is kind of where all these threads start to come together,
Yeah, it really explicitly acknowledges that biodiversity is not just this biological concept. It's deeply intertwined with human societies and cultures.
which makes sense because humans are part of the ecosystem, right?
Right.
We're impacted by it, and our values shape how we see and interact with the natural world.
Right, and this socio-ecological framing really encourages us to move beyond thinking about humans and nature as these separate things. It recognizes that different cultures have different ways of knowing and valuing nature, and that these diverse perspectives are really crucial for effective conservation.
And the Stanford Encyclopedia entry highlights this point with examples from indigenous knowledge systems. Their understanding of biodiversity is often very different from the Western scientific perspective, yet incredibly sophisticated in its own right.
Exactly. For many indigenous communities, biodiversity isn't just about, how many species there are, but about the relationships between all living things, the balance and harmony within the ecosystem, and the responsibility to maintain that balance for future generations.
It's a much more holistic and interconnected view. It challenges us to think beyond just the purely scientific measures of diversity.
And this is where this socio-ecological framing gets really interesting for a philosopher. It forces us to confront the question of, whose values are being prioritized when we talk about biodiversity conservation.
Because even if we all agree that biodiversity is important, the specific aspects of diversity we choose to protect are going to reflect certain values and priorities.
And those values might differ significantly between cultures, communities, even individuals. What might be considered valuable biodiversity from a Western scientific perspective could be totally different from what an indigenous community values in their local ecosystem.
So how do we navigate these potentially conflicting values? How do we make sure that conservation efforts are not only scientifically sound, but also socially just and culturally sensitive?
That's a key challenge, and there's no easy answer, but the socio-ecological framing gives us some important guidelines. It encourages us to engage with diverse stakeholders, to incorporate local knowledge systems, and to prioritize equity and justice in how we make decisions about conservation.
So it's about shifting from a top-down, expert-driven approach to a more participatory and collaborative model where local communities have a real voice in shaping conservation strategies.
Exactly. And this brings us back to the debate about the term biodiversity itself. Some argue that the term is just too broad, too vague, and that it obscures all the different ways that people value and relate to nature.
So by using this one catch-all term, we might be accidentally silencing those diverse voices and perspectives.
Right. And that's where these ideas of biodiversity deflationism and biodiversity eliminativism come in. They suggest that maybe we'd be better off using more specific language, focusing on the particular values and aspects of nature that we're trying to protect.
So instead of talking about biodiversity in this abstract way, we might talk about the cultural significance of a particular species, or the ecosystem services provided by a healthy forest, or even the aesthetic beauty of a diverse landscape.
Exactly. By being more specific, we can connect with people on a deeper level and create more targeted and meaningful conservation actions.
And it also allows us to be more transparent about the values that are driving those actions, which is crucial for building trust and consensus.
And ultimately, that's what effective conservation is all about. It's about finding ways to bridge the gap between science values and action.
Well, this has been a real mind-bending deep dive. We started with what seemed like a simple concept, biodiversity, and we ended up exploring this whole web of interconnected ideas about measurement ethics, cultural perspectives, the very nature of the human-nature relationship.
Yeah, it really highlights that biodiversity conservation is not just a scientific challenge, it's a philosophical one too. It forces us to grapple with these fundamental questions about what we value, how we define those values, and how we translate those values into action.
And for you, our philosopher listener, we hope this exploration has given you some food for thought, some new perspectives on this biodiversity crisis, and maybe even some inspiration for how you can engage with these complex issues in your own work.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you'll keep exploring this fascinating world of biodiversity and pondering these profound questions it raises about our place in the web of life.